Hey, good morning, Facebook Live, YouTube world. It is Sunday, June 28th, 2020. We are picking up the series again based on the lives of Saul, David, and Solomon. A series called The Heart of a King. Thanks for coming. I hope you enjoyed live worship with us today. Not something we do a lot, very often on Facebook Live, but we wanted you to be a part of that today. And now we're doing the same thing you are with the message. I give the congregation a few announcements and maybe a little bit of discussion on some housekeeping issues. So we'll save you that, and I promise to be a little bit shorter today. That is the goal. But we're in the story of Saul. I think this is about the third message in this series. The people, if you have a Bible, 1 Samuel chapter 11 is where we're going to be reading. The people of Israel came to God and asked for a king. And through the prophet Samuel, God agreed to let them do that. This was in chapter 8 of 1 Samuel. We're going to, as I say, we're going to be in chapter 11. And in chapter 9, God chose Saul from them, and the man that's a head taller. And it remains to see, as we're going to study the life of Saul, is he merely a head taller, or is his heart also truer to God? And we're going to touch on that theme a little bit today. But God was approved by Samuel and by God in front of the people. He was anointed. We should note, this is where we ended last week, that he experienced some opposition from a group that was notable enough or large enough or at least vocal enough that Saul didn't say anything when they voiced their opposition to him becoming king. So the beginning of his reign is very subdued, and he just, at the end of chapter 10, he just goes home and doesn't say anything, doesn't respond to his critics. And as I said, the beginning of his reign was just very low-key and subdued. It says, and Saul went home. But today, in chapter 11, that is going to change. And we're going to see God moving into the life of Saul, affirming him as king. And as I mentioned, we should be brief today because it's not a very long chapter. And I just want to work our way through this short story. It's probably not very familiar to us. And then when we get to the end, we'll make some application. And we just want to note some characteristics in Saul's first kingly action. Well, what are some characteristics of him that come to the fore? And we'll point those things out along the way, and then we'll talk about them more at the end. But I had mentioned last week that there was a garrison of Philistines in Saul's hometown of Gibeah, where he went home to last week. And here in chapter 11, there's going to be an attack. But interestingly enough, it doesn't come from those Philistines, those people that we know for many, many years were enemies of the Israelites and attacked them and oppressed them on and on over and over again. And even though they have a barracks in Saul's hometown and he's been anointed king and chosen in a very public ceremony, that's not where the attack comes from. And I don't really know the explanation for that. Possibly Saul was so low-key that they didn't even realize he had been made king and didn't think anything about it or weren't worried about it. And there are some things here in chapter 11 that might make us think that is also true. So look at 1 Samuel chapter 11, verse 1. It says, Nahash, the Ammonite, came up and laid siege to Jabesh Gilead. Now, three things you know. Nahash is a leader. The Ammonite is a group of people that are descendants of Lot, way back to the time of Abraham, and they are on the in my mind I have to picture on the east side of the Jordan River, and they come up around the north of towards the Dead Sea. The Jordan River runs from the Sea of Galilee, and then as the Jordan River runs down into the Dead Sea. Well, just at the foot of the Sea of Galilee is where we're talking about Jabesh Gilead, where they attack. So these men come, they lay siege to this city called Jabesh Gilead. It says, verse 1, all the men of Jabesh said to him, make a treaty with us, and we will serve you. And they're talking about they tried to make this treaty with Nahash. Verse 2, Nahash the Ammonite replied, I'll make one with you on this condition, that I gouge out everyone's right eye and humiliate all of Israel. He doesn't seem too conciliatory at this point. There's one of my study Bibles had a note that he had taken everyone's eye in the whole area. So this wasn't a joke. It was a serious thing. We should probably note his arrogance and his assumption here that Israel nor Saul are going to do anything about this. He does not mention Saul at all. He just comes in and says, hey, here's the deal. We're taking over. And if you don't like it, we'll take your eye. And there is some reason for us to believe that the reason Israel asked for a king was that this was kind of in the shadows lurking anyway, this attack. And they wanted someone like Saul, a warrior, to lead them in battle. And they are going to get it today. There's an interesting concept. There's so many things you could study in every passage, and there's so much stuff I don't tell you about, but the idea of the one eye thing is it only makes a people good for working as servants and slaves, and eliminates you as a soldier or a warrior. There's the idea that if you had a shield and you hold it up in front of you, you're covering your left eye, and if there is no right eye, you can't do archery and those sorts of things. But sort of interesting if you're interested in warfare and those ideas. But look at verse 3. Jabesh Gilead's about to strike a deal because apparently they are worried that he will attack. Don't do anything to us for 7 days, the elders of Jabesh said to him, and let us send messengers throughout the territory of Israel. If no one saves us, we will surrender to you. So when the first time I read this through, I thought, what in the world? Why would he give them 7 days? Is today you surrender or today you die? It's up to you. But he agrees to this request. Now it's possible that part of the deal is he was so arrogant and he thought, sure, and I'll just take your eye when this is done. He was somebody calls this is foolhardy swagger. He perhaps is so confident that if the entire nation of Israel shows up, that he could still take them all and end up getting more land than he had originally intended. Another commentary said that he believes that Israel's in such political disarray, which was likely true, because if you didn't know about Saul, you're thinking Samuel was a religious priest, the last of the judges, and there's no one for them to rally. And perhaps that's why Nahash has sensed this idea. Sure, take your 7 days, go ahead, and let's see what you come back with. So verse 4. When the messengers came to Gibeah, Saul's hometown, and told the terms to the people, all wept aloud. So the people's first reaction isn't, hey, let's find Saul, it's to weep. Just then Saul was coming in from the field behind his oxen. What's the matter with the people? Why are they weeping? Saul inquired. And they repeated to him the words of the men from Jabesh. A couple interesting thoughts here. I mentioned that all the people are weeping. They don't think, even though Saul has been anointed king, they cried out for a warrior. Saul has been chosen and anointed. He seems to still be living a kind of humble farmer sort of life. It says he's behind the oxen when the people show up. And Saul, I know I've said that before. I mean Saul when I say Paul. But Saul says, why are the people crying? And he hears this story about Nahash's threat. And Israel's first response to that threat is not summon the troops, let's get our warrior leader, but one of weeping and mourning. We should also take a note that there are close ties between the people of Jabesh Gilead, where Nahash has made this threat, and the tribe of Benjamin, which is the tribe that Saul is from. The people know where Saul is, and they've at least come to his city, either directly to him or indirectly to his hometown, hoping that maybe he'll overhear. But I'm sure they're eager to see how he's going to respond as a king. The interesting thing, one of the more interesting things about Jabesh Gilead, and you'd only know this from the ending of Saul's life, in 1 Samuel 31, at Saul's death, he is captured, I believe it's the Philistines at that point. He and Jonathan and the men around him are captured, killed, and brought into one of the cities there, and their bodies are displayed on the wall. And it is the men of Jabesh Gilead who, I think in the middle of the night, they at least have to fight, and they recover their bodies, the irreverence and the lack of respect for their kings. And it's thought that this story of Saul's actions that he's about to take here are the reasons that they would do that at the end of Saul's life. And it's one of the commentators notes that it's strange that Saul's first march should have been by night from Beth Shan to Jabesh, where he's about to go and stand up to Nahash. It is the same route by which at the last they carried his dead body at night. So keep that in mind. Just a fascinating thing, a little tie there that you probably wouldn't realize unless you have a wider scope of Scripture and what's going on. Look at verse 6 here in 1 Samuel 11. When Saul heard these words, the Spirit of God suddenly came powerfully on him, and his anger burned furiously. He took a team of oxen, cut them in pieces, and sent them throughout the territory of Israel by messengers who said, "This is what will be done to the ox of anyone who doesn't march behind Saul and Samuel." As a result, the terror of the Lord fell on the people, and they went out united. Wonderful things happening here at Saul's first thing. He is zealous for his people. The first thing we know is that the Spirit of God suddenly came powerfully on him. This isn't the first time. We saw it a couple weeks ago in chapter 10 and maybe chapter 9, where it says that Saul was even a changed man. So we realize that when the Spirit of God comes onto Saul, he removes him from lowly servanthood and rises him up to be a leader of the king, behind which they are united. It reminds me of this idea of some sort of righteous indignation. He's infuriated by the treatment of his own people. And you remember the story of David and Goliath, and we'll get there probably maybe later on this summer, when Goliath comes out and taunts the nation of Israel, and David says, "Why are you standing for this? I come to you in the name of the God of Israel," and he's just this anger about him. And probably the most important aspect that we note in this chapter is once again the Spirit of God on Saul. It's a phrase that is common in the book of Judges, and it describes many judges that way, that the Spirit of the Lord came on him and he delivered them from their oppressors. And there's many references of that in the book of Judges. It's the essential phrase in this whole chapter. As I said, we saw it last week. Saul has now accepted the authority of the king, the anointing, and he's combined it with the filling of the Spirit and this righteous indignation, this desire to defend his own people. And now he's called into action, and the text notes that the people are now united, which would be the first time we have seen that in many years. So if we look at verse 8. Here's Saul is clearly in charge now. Saul counted them. He sent this threat out to all the other people and said, "Your oxen are going to be like this. If you don't join us for battle, your oxen will be destroyed." Saul counted them at Bezek. There were 300,000 Israelites and 30,000 men from Judah. He told the messengers who had come, "Tell this to the men of Jabesh Gilead, deliverance will be yours tomorrow by the time the sun is hot." So the messengers told the men of Jabesh, and they rejoiced. So it's about 50 or 60 miles between Jabesh Gilead and where Saul was in Gibeah. And I don't know how long it took the men from Jabesh Gilead to arrive in Gibeah, but we can assume at least a couple days. And when Saul finds out, he says, "We'll be there tomorrow." So that's a long way to go. It was about a day and a half, I think, that he gets there, because they attack in the middle of the night. In verse 10, then the men of Jabesh said to Nahash, "Tomorrow we will come out, and you can do whatever you want to us." Perhaps the 7 days, perhaps it took the whole time. The next day Saul organized the troops into 3 divisions. During the morning watch, they invaded the Ammonite camp and slaughtered them until the heat of the day. There were survivors, but they were so scattered that no 2 of them were left together. So there's several things that we need to note here. It's possible that Saul responded to this cause so quickly that Nahash was unprepared. It is very likely that he wasn't expecting any resistance at all. And the second thing we need to know is, to this point, we have no reason to believe that Saul has any sort of military training for warfare, and we should expect some surprise at his success. It says when he shows up, he organized them into 3 divisions. They attacked. It says the morning watch was about 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. Now, it's possible that Saul had been engaged in battles before and had strategy, but we don't see any layout of that in Scripture anywhere else. We see him often behind oxen and hiding behind baggage and those sorts of things. So when the Spirit of God comes on Saul, there's this radical transformation that he not only gains wisdom and courage in this righteous indignation, but also it appears that he has now some military skill and strategy. And we have to give that credit to the Spirit of God. Verse 12. Afterward, the people said to Samuel, "Who said that Saul should not reign over us? Give us those men so we can kill them." Now, this is referring back to the end of chapter 10. Remember when Saul was first anointed? There were some men who said, "Who is this guy? Why is he in charge?" And Saul just kind of went on his way back to his home. I pointed that out to you. So now that Saul has triumphed militarily, people are saying, "Who is that said Saul shouldn't be in charge of us? Give us them so we can kill them." Verse 13, "But Saul ordered, no one will be executed this day, for today the Lord has provided deliverance in Israel." Saul gives credit where it is due. Verse 14, "Then Samuel said to the people." Now Samuel shows up in this chapter. This is the first time. We haven't seen him consulted before. But somewhere along the way, Samuel got involved in the story. And Samuel said to the people, "Come, let's go to Gilgal so we can renew the kingship there." Now, when I read that, I thought, didn't we already do this and anoint Saul at the, I can't remember the name of the city where he was last week. But the fact is that the news may not have traveled. We don't know the time period between chapter 10 and chapter 11. But the news may not have traveled throughout all of Israel. And now that there's even a more a popular appeal for Saul and this military victory, they want to let the rest of the country know. So they're going to do another ceremony here in Gilgal. Verse 15, so all the people went to Gilgal, and there in the Lord's presence they made Saul king. There they sacrificed fellowship offerings in the Lord's presence, and Saul and all the men of Israel rejoiced greatly. So the first result we see of Saul once he assumes this role of kingship is a victory, a military victory, and patriotic fervor is now high, led by our newly anointed king, who's a head taller than everybody else, and surely their dreams in this moment are coming true. They've asked God for a king. He has given it, and this king has been anointed and affirmed, and now is showing his worth militarily. And now they decide their first action should be after this is to rise up and kill those who had spoken against Saul. As I read that, I thought, man, we are so fickle. We go from groups who admire someone to all of a sudden we're ready to take their lives. People and human hearts are fickle. And Saul wisely in this moment stops it and said, this is not to execute vengeance on my enemies or those who spoke ill of me. He says, no one will be executed this day, for the Lord has provided deliverance. So they go on and they go to another city which is closer to Saul's hometown. And then it says, there in the Lord's presence they made Saul king. They sacrificed fellowship offerings. And an interesting note, in the Lord's presence, and Saul and all the men of Israel rejoiced greatly. So it's likely that not everyone could attend. Mizpah was the name of that city where Saul was anointed last week in chapter 10. And this affirms Saul's reign in another part of the country. So this is where we come to conclude today. The title of this message, I called it A Kingly Combination. Because there's a lot of characteristics that we see in Saul here that are very kingly and worthy of someone who God has chosen and anointed and called to be king. So we're going to take note of those. But then at the end, we're going to take a few things that we'd like to see that we don't see here that may or may not appear later. The first thing I want to note, I pointed this out to you, the Spirit of God fills him here in verse 6. We saw it last week. We would declare that is probably the most important thing, most important factor in Saul's life, that the first time it happened, he becomes a different man. His heart is changed. And that's important. That's going to be important for us to remember about Saul as we move through this series. The second thing we see in this passage here in chapter 11, once again, is humility. He's out in the field just plowing with his oxen, doing farm work, even though he's already been anointed as king, and we know this is going to happen. He's still, in verse 7, he's deferring to Samuel in some ways. We see Samuel shows up. The third thing we would note is that about his zeal for Israel. He has compassion and concern for their weeping. In verses 5 through 7, we saw him say, "Why are you weeping?" And in that moment, I think it even says his anger is stirred up, which we'll talk about that in a second. We need to remember that. But he is moved to action on behalf of his people, and he has another kingly qualification. He has courage and faith and confidence in going into this battle, and wisdom and strategy as well. He divides his troops up. He's also wise in showing mercy and refusing to kill those who were his detractors in the previous week. He wasn't willing to execute punishment and judgment on those accusers, but instead what happens here is they return glory to God through sacrifices and worship and rejoicing. So the other good thing we would note about Paul here is that he has the people's favor. He has fought for their freedom and freed them militarily. But he also has their favor because they're even willing to kill anybody who speaks against him now. So there's 4 or 5 things that we would say are worthwhile to note about Saul in this kingly combination. The Spirit of God is on him. He has humility. He has compassion and concern for his fellow people. And he has zeal to rise up, a righteous indignation to fight on their behalf. He has courage and faith in going into battle. He has wisdom as far as numbering his troops, and he's not going to kill his detractors, and he also has the people's favor. So there's a good thing. So I began to think about that this week and thought, well, that's nice, but you probably know more about Saul than just the kingly combination. But I began to ask myself, so what's missing? What questions and concerns should we have about Saul being king? Why might we hesitate? Interestingly enough, before Saul went off to fight Nahash, he did not consult Samuel or God before attempting it. Now it says he had the Spirit of the Lord on him, but often we'll see it often in the life of David, that before any battles, David would consult, say, should we go to war or not? And we didn't see that here with Saul, and we'll take note of that and mark it down for the future. So the second thing that we would note about Saul that might not be present is mostly unknown, and that's his character. I mean, we know he's humble. We know he has this righteous zeal. But what is his personal relationship with God? Does he trust him? Does he follow his spiritual leaders? Really, we can't judge one way or the other as of today, but we want to make a note that we don't know that yet. The third thing that I thought about Paul that's missing is that he is possibly impulsive. And this resulted from the fact that he didn't consult Samuel or God before attempting to fight this battle. And I thought he's really just kind of a guy that works with blinders on. What's in front of him at the moment? For a while it was oxen, and now it's his brethren mourning because of this attempt by Nahash, and he's just instantly he's anger, and he raises up a group of army to go and fight them. And I thought, well, he may not be able to grasp the big picture. And he seems to drift or be led along or focused in on specific situations that are right in front of him. And he doesn't have a general grasp of the big picture of things, like I said. So there's three things. He didn't consult God. We have unknown character questions. It's possible that he's impulsive, and I mentioned this just briefly. We're still not really clear on what is his devotion to God. Now, both Samuel and God had made clear to Israel and to Saul that the king was still to be serving God, and as long as his heart was true to God, God would be faithful to them. And that's a little unclear for us, but we're going to see that, I guarantee you, in the next couple weeks with Saul. Several of these character flaws are going to come to the fore. But I wanted to point out to us today that there are some good things in Saul, and there are also some things that we have question marks about. And those question marks we're going to see in the upcoming weeks. So I wanted to challenge you today in your own personal walk with Christ. There are certainly good things, good characteristics and qualities that God has placed in your life. And He wants you to nourish them and strengthen them and grow them. And usually sometimes we're not as aware of those as we are of our own faults. And we also have faults as well. And we're going to see that some of Saul's questions lead to his downfall. In a couple weeks, we're going to talk about a message titled Fear, Failure, and Foreshadowing. We're going to see that in the life of Saul. So you probably have faults in your own life as well. And let me encourage you, God knows those as well. And you can surrender those to Him, those faults, and ask Him to help you to overcome. Maybe it's just a temptation or a sin that you constantly give into. So let me challenge you with that today. And I wanted to close not just by noting these characteristics and some questions about Saul's character, but I wanted to close with a few verses from the next chapter, which is chapter 12. And for the most part, we're going to skip it, but I'm just going to read a few end verses in verse 20. And in this, the reason we're not studying chapter 12 is because it's mostly about Samuel, who is, he's not completely fading out of the picture today, but there's almost like a transition chapter where he surrenders more of his authority to Saul. And he does pop up here and again, and we'll see him in a couple places. But he's offering final words, and he offers a warning to the nation of Israel. He's recounting some of their history. And he urges them to follow God, and he speaks an important word to those in difficult circumstances. And to me, this is really a text that would apply to us. I was thinking about myself and about the state of our world today. So I want to read 1 Samuel chapter 12, 20 to 25. The last couple verses there, 20 to 24. The last couple verses are going to be our benediction today. But think about Samuel offering these words. It says in verse 20, "And Samuel said to the people, 'Do not be afraid, you have done all this evil.'" And he talks about them asking for a king. He still says, God wanted to be your king, but you've done this. He says, "Yet do not turn aside from following the Lord, but serve the Lord with all your heart. And do not turn aside after empty things that cannot profit or deliver, for they are empty. Verse 22, for the Lord will not forsake his people, for his great name's sake, because it has pleased the Lord to make you a people for himself. There's several kingly qualities about Samuel also, recognizing God's sovereignty even over people's sins and choices. Samuel's political power and authority are on the wane and has been transferred to Saul, but his spiritual leadership remains intact, or at least it should, but that's up to Saul. And we'll definitely look at those in the next couple weeks. Next week, I'm going to spend, I believe, as of today, next Sunday will be a message titled With Liberty and Justice for All. It's July 5th. We'll talk a little bit about what is great about America. And it's probably not your typical God bless America, wave the flag thing, because I'm not that kind of a guy. But I've been thinking through this, and there are many, many ways that America is one of the greatest nations on earth, if not the greatest nation on earth. So I want to challenge you. We'll be here next week at 11:15. You can always join us in-house on Sunday mornings. We have plenty of room for you. We're all spread out still. But let me pray for you, and then our benediction will be those final couple verses there in 1 Samuel chapter 12. Father, I thank you for those who are watching today. We are aware of the good things and the bad things about our personality, about the choices that we make, Lord. And so often we feel only the weak and fragile parts, but I know, and you have affirmed in each of us that you have qualities that you intend for us to use for your honor and your glory. We saw those in Saul. His anger at the treatment of your people, his willingness to serve, to rise up and serve you, even probably in a situation that he did not feel capable or qualified. You used him to deliver your people. Well, I pray that you would do that in each of us. Strengthen in us those qualities that you have planted in us, so that you may get the honor and the glory for that, as we saw here as well in the life of Saul. Lord, help us with our weaknesses. We are very aware of those. We surrender them to you. Lord, in our moments of weakness, help us to cry out to you in a lament, in cries of desperation, and just a sincere attitude of prayer. Lord, we know that your Spirit can deliver us from all the things. You've promised us victory in overcoming the world. And we want to claim those promises today. We thank you for the words of Samuel in 1 Samuel chapter 12. Moreover, as for me, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord by ceasing to pray for you. And I will instruct you in the good and the right way. Only fear the Lord and serve him faithfully with all your heart, for consider what great things he has done for you. And that would be my challenge and my benediction for you today. Fear the Lord, serve him faithfully, consider what great things he has done for you. God bless. Have a great week, and I'll be back on Tuesday at 9 o'clock.